The investigation was conducted by a multi-jurisdictional team and monitored by investigators from the Pierce County Prosecutor's Office. The investigation consisted of audio and video recorded statements from 11 eyewitnesses, most of whom were civilian employees working in the lumberyard. We analyzed video, gathered a variety of physical evidence, and interviewed the two involved officers. The evidence, witness statements, and officer statements all support the following account. On April 21st at 1:15, an employee of the Pinnacle Lumber Plywood Warehouse called 911, stating an unknown male, later identified as Daniel Covarrubias, entered the lumberyard and looked like he was running from the police. The caller told the 911 operator that Mr. Covarrubias had climbed up to the top of a 25-foot lumber rack and was hiding. Officers David Butts and Ryan Hamilton arrived on scene at 1:20 and entered the lumberyard, while a third officer went around to the back to act as containment. Officers Butts and Hamilton approached the lumber rack and attempted to verbally communicate with Mr. Covarrubias, who is non-communicative. Mr. Covarrubias was in a crouched position on top of the elevated stack of lumber and was seen reaching into his pockets. Officers gave him numerous commands to show his hands, but Mr. Covarrubias did not respond. Seconds later, Mr. Covarrubias raised up with a dark object in his hand and pointed it at the officers in a manner that was consistent with pointing a firearm. Mr. Covarrubias crouched back down while officers Butts and Hamilton continued to direct him to show his hands. Mr. Covarrubias quickly raised up a second time and again pointed the dark object at the officers. At that point, officers Butts and Hamilton, both fearing that Mr. Covarrubias was pointing a gun at them, fired their weapons. Their shots began near simultaneously, with a total of 9 shots being fired between the two officers. Mr. Covarrubias dropped again into a crouching position, but quickly rose up again, pointing the dark object at the officers a third time, and then dropped back down onto the lumber. From the first time Mr. Covarrubias pointed the dark object at officers Butts and Hamilton to the last shot being fired was approximately 6 seconds. A ladder was then obtained from the fire department, who was already on scene. Officers climbed up the ladder, made sure Mr. Covarrubias was secure, and lowered him down to the awaiting medical aid to transport to the hospital. It was at this time that we learned the dark object in Mr. Covarrubias' hand was not a gun, but a cell phone. There are some questions that we also tried to answer with this investigation as it unfolded. One of those questions being, why would anybody point something at police officers to mimic a gun, if not a real gun? And the investigation shows that Mr. Covarrubias had potentially been awake for 3 days without food, under the influence of methamphetamine, and possibly hallucinating. In this case, officers Butts and Hamilton made every effort to verbally communicate with Mr. Covarrubias. He would not reply, he would not do anything other than point what they thought was a gun at them, making de-escalation impossible for our officers.